Tell me if you have heard the story before. Byzantine Emperor Michael III called Latin a barbarian language. It's an anecdote that I encounter quite often, mostly as a supposed proof of how the Byzantines weren't actually Romans and rejected everything from classical Rome. It always struck me as suspicious, since I know for a fact that Michael kept using Latin in his coinage. So I decided to put the story into context, and here's what I found. First, let's figure out where the story comes from. If you try and look for a direct quote where Emperor Michael III calls Latin a barbarian language, you're not going to find anything. Our only source for this statement is the response to it, which was sent by Pope Nicholas in the year 865. This exchange of letters happened during a diplomatical conflict between Constantinople and Rome, known as the Photian Schism. The Photian Schism started when Michael asked Pope Nicholas to mediate a dispute over who should be the Patriarch of Constantinople. It started off relatively benign and friendly. The Pope had sent his delegates who didn't want to cause any trouble, and they confirmed the emperor's appointee, Photius. Nicholas, however, wanted to flex his diplomatic muscle, so he rejected the verdict, excommunicated his own delegates, held his own council, and declared that Photius's appointment was unlawful. Things really heated up when the question of Bulgaria got thrown into the mix. The Bulgarian Khan Boris wanted to convert his nation to Christianity, and both the Patriarch and the Pope wanted to have spiritual authority over the newly Christian Bulgarians. The rhetoric got so harsh that at one point Pope Nicholas used the most vile insult imaginable. In his letter to Photius, in addition to being a fratricide and a snake, he accused the Patriarch of being a Jew, and also the Antichrist. The infamous exchange with Michael's comments about the Latin language took place around the same time. As I've said before, we don't have the original letter from Michael, so we have to try and figure out its contents from the response. The author of the response mentions Michael's remark no fewer than 6 times. Apparently, the emperor called Latin not only barbaric, but also a Scythian language. All the papal retorts have this polemical and slightly passive-aggressive tone. You have broken out into such a fury that you are attacking the Latin language in your letter, calling it barbaric and Scythian, thus insulting the one who created it. We are sorry that your excellency is not jeopardized by the fact that they are Christians whose language you call barbaric and Scythian. Popular historians generally take these comments at face value and jump to a conclusion that Michael actually insulted the Latin language and called it barbaric and Scythian. But I think we should take a moment and investigate the circumstances surrounding this exchange. The main thing making me skeptical of this popular interpretation is the person of the author. The letter wasn't written by Pope Nicholas himself, but by his secretary, Anastasius The Librarian. And this Anastasius was quite a character. Despite his Greek name, Anastasius doesn't come from a Greek-speaking family. Some of his translations contain mistakes which couldn't have been made by a native speaker. The record of one of his trials also mentions an uncle by the name of Ado, which would suggest a Frankish ancestry. His family was well connected in the church, so Anastasius was slated for a solid ecclesiastical career. However, his ambitions were much grander. When he got an appointment which may have hindered his path to the papal throne, he refused to take it and abandoned his church post. For this, he was excommunicated and anathematized. But the papacy wasn't getting rid of him that easily. Anastasius's uncle was an influential bishop with good connections at the court of the Frankish emperor. In 855, during a papal interregnum, he convinced the emperor to make his nephew an imperial antipope. Anastasius entered Rome on a horseback at the head of an armed force, installed himself on a papal throne, and burned the frescoes depicting the council at which he had been excommunicated. However, he didn't have any support within the city, so only after 3 days was forced out and had to flee. This would have put an end to the career of other men, but not of Anastasius. He had to spend a couple of years in the monastery, but in 858 the new Pope Nicholas I brought him in to be his secretary. Apparently his language skills were so indispensable that the papacy was willing to overlook his record of making trouble. Okay, so he was ambitious and kind of a troublemaker. This isn't anything too extraordinary, so why would I be especially suspicious of him? That is because Anastasius was never shy about his attitude to the Eastern Roman Empire. Essentially, he's an OG Byzantines aren't real Romans guy. A lot of arguments you'd hear denying the Romanness of the Byzantines originate from him. Here's what Anastasius wrote later in his life as the secretary to the Carolingian Emperor Louis II. The Greeks, for their kakodoxy, that is wrong thinking, have ceased to be the emperors of the Romans. Not only have they deserted the city and the capital of the empire, but they have also abandoned Roman nationality and even the language. They have migrated to another capital and taken up a completely different nationality and language. On another occasion, he writes that Louis has a better claim to the title of Roman Emperor because it was bestowed on him by the Pope, whereas in the East the so-called emperors were sometimes acclaimed by the Senate, the people and the armies. In his correspondence with the Pope, he writes that deceit is a custom of the Greeks, so we can be sure that his attitude to the Eastern Empire was the same during his service in the Papal Secretariat. So we have a Papal Secretary who's not particularly fond of the Eastern Romans, penning a letter to the Emperor at a time of diplomatic tension between Rome and Constantinople. I think it's fair to assume that he might have willfully misinterpreted and exaggerated the insult of the original statement. And some of the context actually shows through all of the feigned outrage of Anastasius' response. In one of the 6 mentions of the supposed insult, he writes the following: "Finally, if you call barbaric that language because it creates barbarisms when it's rendered by the translators into Greek, the mistake, in our opinion, is not due to the Latin language, but to the translators who did not render sense for sense as they should, but impetuously word for word." This hints at the notion that Michael's comment was not targeted at the Latin language itself, but at the way it was being used by the Western clergy. More specifically, it might have been a comment on the version of Latin used by the papacy. Latin in the 9th century wasn't a unified and codified language like classical Latin. There were multiple variants of it, some of which later became the Romance languages, and others which formed the basis of the modern-day Church Latin. The Western clergy at the time was predominantly Frankish, so their variant of Vulgar Latin used many elements from Germanic languages. You also have to remember that the Photian Schism was not only political, but also a doctrinal dispute. And the main doctrinal point of contention was the Filioque clause. Filioque is an addition to the Latin version of the Nicene Creed, which states that the Holy Spirit proceeds both from the Father and the Son, as opposed to just the Father, as in the Greek language version. Because these fine theological points often rely on one's mastery of the language, I think it's probable that Michael's original comments were not about the Latin language in itself, but about how the Western clergy introduces barbarisms into liturgy through their use of Vulgar Latin. And Anastasius, who was always keen on stirring up the conflict between Rome and Constantinople, knowingly misinterpreted his words, so that he could launch into another one of his polemics about how Michael isn't a real Roman emperor. It would have been very in character for him, and it would have made much more sense than the Eastern Roman emperor calling Latin a barbarian language, while using it in his court ceremonies and coinage. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments if this version sounds more plausible to you or not. For those of you who want to learn more about this particular topic, I am including a link to a paper called A War of Languages by Evangelos Chrysos, which goes into more detail. I'd also like to thank Mulai Cherkawi, Conventus Orbis, Pikimis, and others for supporting me on Patreon. And for the rest of you, thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next one.